Master your money, free your future. Welcome to Budget for Life. My name is Jeremy. I am a financial advisor, but this video and this channel is not financial advice. This is a place for level-headed company analysis, looking at their fundamentals, right? And right now we're focusing on GameStop. In this video, I want to project their hardware sales for Q3. Before I get into that, I just want to say thank you to the channel viewers, to the subscribers, over 1,600 subs, to those who join as fans or as friends, get awesome perks with the videos, get access to my GameStop spreadsheet, and most importantly, just support the channel because 100% of the revenue made from this channel is going into GME DRS booked shares. I get paid for the first time in October for these September earnings. So thank you so much to anyone who supports in any way that you can. I appreciate it a lot. When you're talking about Q3 hardware, GameStop's hardware business, it really comes down to how many Switch 2s are they going to sell. They also have accessories, and their accessories are lumped into their hardware business. So basically, that's headphones and controllers, but also they have some computer parts, they have keyboards and mouses, they've got probably USB flash drives. I mean, there's all types of little knickknacks that get added into hardware accessories. But when you look at, okay, what happened from Q1 to Q2 in 2025, you see that the hardware had a huge bump, $250 million bump, quarter over quarter in hardware sales, Q1 to Q2. And guess what their net sales grew? $240 million, right? So software sales went down 20, collectibles went up 10, so that's a net minus 10. And then you've got 250 in the right direction over here on the hardware sales. So basically 100% of GameStop's sales growth quarter over quarter can be attributed to the Switch 2 launched during Q2 of 2025. So, GameStop has said a lot about their collectibles business. Long term, this is their pivot for as far as GameStop, the retailer. I think this will become the most valuable portion of GameStop's retail business in the long run. And in the longer run, GameStop's asset management business will become even more valuable than all three of their retail lines combined, and probably already is, if we're being honest. But in the short run, related to their retail business, the hardware sales are the biggest driver of revenue growth. I mean, just in Q2, it was 61% of their revenue was hardware. And so, what is this number in Q3 is going to be, in many ways, probably the most important figure for what is their total revenue going to be and what is their operating income going to be in Q3. If you're projecting this out, in Q2, the Switch 2 was not available the whole quarter. It came out, I think, June 6th or 7th, and GameStop's Q2 is May, June, July. So only 2 of the 3 months was the Switch 2 available. That said, I would say the first 2 months, with it being it just launched, is probably equivalent to 3 months moving forward because you have that pent up demand, right? The release day. They're going to be able to sell literally as many as they can the day that they come on the shelf on the launch day in that week in that month, whereas sales in the following months might not be like quite as high of a demand. I wonder, like, can you get a Switch 2 from GameStop, or are they continued to just be sold out nonstop? Switch 2 console. Looks like maybe they are sold out currently. Oh no, there they are. Okay, yeah, you got the Switch 2. Let's see. New looks like it's available. Yeah, limited stock. Okay, so Case in point, right here. If you want to Switch 2, you can go get one right now. In Q2, it's a long, long line. It's a long wait. Everyone wants to get it first. And so I'd say that first month of Switch 2 sales in June, I'd say is probably similar to what you're going to get in 2 months of Q3 Switch 2 sales. On the other side of the coin, though, Q3 and especially Q4, you get into the holiday season impact of sales. And by no means am I trying to suggest that the demand for Switch 2 is leveling off or tapering off. You can see a console cycle, it really has a pretty strong and steady demand for several years. If we go back to 2018 and beyond, this row 26 I have there, just their hardware dollar revenue numbers. And you can see at the end of the last generation's consoles, their hardware sales were declining pretty substantially year over year. A $500 million drop, followed by another $200 million drop, bottomed out at 2.5 billion annually before the 2020 and really 21 console cycle, where Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo all came out with new consoles. And you can see how that number bumped them 600, is that $650 million of additional revenue that following year on the past console cycle. And look how that stayed steady, 3.14, 3.17, an entire year later from still those same consoles. And look, an entire year later, they're down 150 million, but still about 450 million higher than where they had bottomed out before. And then you see it finally kind of taper off a cliff in 2024 from those 2020 consoles, right? The 4-year-old consoles, you really start to see that demand wane. Simultaneously, GameStop was closing stores, right? So we know a portion of these pullbacks in revenue are related to GameStop's smaller footprint. But the point is, the demand for Switch 2 is going to most likely continue to be strong for several years out, even if you're not entirely bullish on GameStop's hardware business as a whole. And we'll get into probably a separate video as far as valuing GameStop's hardware business long term. But one point I just wanted to iterate as it relates to that is every time a new console is created, the old consoles don't disappear, right? The Segas are still out there. The GameCubes, the N64s, they're still out there. Are they declining in number as more and more of them get broken, whatever? Sure, but the overall global hardware business will grow in line with, to a certain extent, the global video game business, which is certainly a growing industry. And so Nintendo Switch 2, they have their console. We don't have the Xbox console or PlayStation console yet. Those are still in the works. But those consoles get added to this large pool of generations worth of consoles now that, again, GameStop can leverage through their trade-in model, through their refurb expertise. And so even though the hardware business is cyclical, right? The new wave comes, you get a revenue spike in line with that, and then revenue begins to fade as those consoles get older, and then you're dependent on the next wave being created to then see where your next peak might end up. It's not cyclical in a flat basis. It's not just up and then back to the same and then up to the same and then back to the same. But as each generation of consoles is getting created, basically you see this up and then this down and then up a little bit higher next cycle and then down, but not as far down as the down before, right? Sorry, I'm just doing this with my hand instead of showing you on like Microsoft Paint or something. But you get the idea, right? Higher highs, lower lows is what GameStop's trying to accomplish through their trade-in model. It's what is likely to happen through the overall increased quantity of consoles out there. Even AR and VR type hardware, right? Your MetaQuest, etc. Also, a sneaky business that GameStop exited years ago, right? They thought years ago, what if we got into laptops or especially phones as a way to kind of diversify our hardware business from this cyclicality. But they sold that business, and this post from 3 years ago confirmed like they were not selling phones at all. They exited that business. But look who came back on the scene this January, January of 2025. Have TikTok, GameStop will buy your phone, right? This is GameStop's post. And they say, don't have TikTok, we will also buy your phone. And they posted more recently, just a few weeks ago, this September, a trade-in offer for the new iPhone. So how much of the phone business will GameStop be able to steal from legacy phone plan, your AT&T Verizon? I don't know. I don't think this is necessarily a super, significant part of GameStop's hardware business currently, but it's just another kind of conversation point related to, yes, hardware is still, it's going to be cyclical with new console launches. That's always going to create a huge demand, right? 250 million additional dollars sold in just one quarter, right? That's $1 billion if you annualize that. An extra $1 billion for a company that sold $3.8 billion total in 2024, right? That alone, and that's just the Switch 2, right? That's not including the Xbox and PlayStation consoles that are to come, right? So it's always going to be cyclical, but the cyclicality does not have to be net neutral as far as can you project growth to the hardware business. All that to say, set valuation aside, we'll dive into kind of floor, fair, and fly scenarios for the hardware business later. And a weighted average, by the way. In my recent video about the software business, I added this column to say, okay, what's the probability of the floor? What's the probability of the fair? What's the probability of the fly? And if you take the weighted average of those valuations with those probabilities, you get, okay, a weighted average software business of 2.3 billion. I'm excited to see what the hardware business checks out at. And these assumptions you can change, right? And say, okay, well, what if it levels? What if you're even more bearish? What if you think it's 15 million a year after the decline? Okay, then this is going to be more like, 20, $250 million business that you would say. And if that's a 30% weight, then how does that affect here, right? You can mess with all those assumptions. Hardware, Q3. I think taking a you know, $250 million bump from Q1 to Q2 and basically stamping that into Q3 is probably a good starting point. And when you're looking at the dollar amounts year over year, right? Q1 to Q1, they sold 500 million in Q1 of 2024 compared with 345. And so that going up by 250 put you at 592. But that 592 is really like 100 million more than what they sold in Q1 of last year. You see this Q2 to Q3, a little bit of a dip there, a little bit of a dip in 2023, a little bit of a spike in 22. Sorry about that. And a larger spike in 2021. What does this tell me? This tells me that the newer that the console cycle, the newer the console is, the earlier that you see the holiday bump start to take root. So 2021, this is the first Q3 that you have these new consoles out. And so you see some of that Q4 demand getting pulled forward into Q3. And you see it still a little bit the following year as well, even though the consoles were a year old, right? This is, a 10% bump quarter over quarter that first year. In 2022, it's more like a 5% bump quarter over quarter. And then you see it kind of head the other direction, a 3 or so% drop, and then closer to like a 7 or 8% drop. So quarter over quarter, I would expect Q3's dollar figure to basically pull forward some of the Q4 holiday demand and also just to continue the trend of the outperformance that you saw in Q2. So if you're trying to put an exact number to it, it's like, well, in Q2 of 24, you beat that figure by $140 million, right? Yeah, $141 million. So you could say that worst case, $141 million more than the Q3 figure would put you at, to round up 1 or 2 mil, basically a 560 would be kind of like your low end worst case revenue amount for Q3. But here's the thing, you almost certainly know that this number is going to be higher than the Q3's number is probably going to be higher than the Q2 number because again, the Switch wasn't out the whole Q2. It's also your first holiday season, pre-holiday season with the Switch 2. Is it going to be astronomically higher? I think that's hard to I think it's hard to project. You could say based on 2021 that Q3 is going to be 10% higher than Q2, right? And for the whole year, that led to a, 20% improvement, really a little bit more than 20%, a little less, about a 25% improvement, almost 30% improvement in the total year numbers, which if this $2 billion number improved by, let's say 30% instead of 25, because we know the Switch 2 has been beating expectations. We know it's the best-selling console in history. That would tell you that the total year could end up being what? AC 26 times 30% higher would tell you 27 billion for the whole year. If 40% of that happened in Q4, which historically 40% of GameStop sales happen in Q4, then that would give you a guesstimate of what? AL 26 minus AK 26 minus AG 26 minus AE 26. So if you say 30% bump for the whole year, 40% of annual sales happen in Q4, that would tell you $700 million revenue for hardware in Q3. Y'all tracking with this so far? You thinking about the different ways to think about this? Hope so. So 560 would be basically your worst case. 700, I wouldn't call that your best case. I wouldn't call that your best case because again, that 30% for the whole year, I think the Switch 2 has the power to beat that. But I do think it's also worth mentioning on the other side of the coin that in 2021, you had three new consoles, not just a new Nintendo, right? It's also worth mentioning in 2021 that I think most of those consoles came out in 2024. or sorry, in 2020 in Q4. And so they had that Q1 bump already in there as well. All that to say, this number could be a little bit aggressive, but the 40% weight in Q4 could be a little bit conservative because this Q1 didn't even account for any consoles, whereas Q1 in 2021 did. All that to say, I'm inclined to go closer to the high end than the low end. This 700 feels like the high end. If you just took that 10% bump quarter over quarter, then that would basically tell you that, hey, we're going to make about $60 million more in Q3 than in Q2, right? That 10% bump, which would put you at about a $650 million hardware sales. I think 650 is probably where you want to be just because it's $90 million higher than your worst case 560, and it's $50 million lower than your really great case 700. At the same time, the implications for that on GameStop's total sales growth, I just, it's hard to, I know there were three consoles in 2021, so I really probably shouldn't get more aggressive than this. But if I change this to say, let's say this is only a 20% bump year over year, which would still be impressive, right? 20% growth from your total year hardware sales, 2024 to 2025. That would be impressive in light of the fact that in 2021, there was no Xbox or PlayStation. Or sorry, in 2025, there is no Xbox or PlayStation. And also that GameStop is still closing stores. They've closed approximately 1,000 stores already. If you did that but said that 50% of the sales will happen, okay, yeah, that doesn't necessarily work in GameStop's favor that way. Hmm, a lower number, no matter what, ends up with a lower number in Q3. So again, all this guessing, all this modeling, it just comes down to what do you think Switch 2 is going to do? I'm inclined to go with that quarter over quarter bump that we saw in 2021 Q2 to Q3, 10% higher. I liked that it was also in the middle of these other two ways um to estimate it. 650. Hmm. And so if you call this 650 and then you call this that lowers your Q3 a little bit minus AI 26 minus AG 26 minus AE 26. Yeah, I mean that gives you a crazy Q4. It really just comes down to how much of Q4 gets pulled into Q3, how much of Q2 sales were delayed by or negatively impacted by the fact that the Switch wasn't available until June, I'm starting to feel like 650 might be a little bit too aggressive, but I don't think it's a wild figure. But it would be like a 50% bump from Q3 of last year. That would be a 50% bump. Man, which Q2 was not, right? But Q2 to Q3 headed in the wrong direction. It would only be a what? It'd be less than a 20% bump from Q1 of last year if they hit 650. And it would be about a 20% bump Q1 of 24 to Q3 of 26 if you called it 700, which when you think about it in those terms, it doesn't sound that crazy. The year over year numbers sound crazier in this little window right here because that was the very, very, very end of the console cycle, which kind of artificially suppresses the numbers. So I'm kind of thinking 700 might be there. If we call this 700 and if we think that means that maybe 1100 is sold in Q4, that 1100 would be about a 50% bump Q4 to Q4, which would be in that same kind of line of a 50% bump Q3 to Q3. Hmm. I'm kind of thinking 700 might be warmer. I think 700 is warmer, guys. I really do. But this does kind of feel like closer to the best case scenario. But I feel like I kind of did that with software too. I'm starting to feel like 235 might be aggressive on software, but I'm betting on Pokemon with that projection. I'm going to call this 685. Let's just call it 690 because 69 nice. And so with just hardware and software, we're already projecting a revenue of 925 million, which means we're projecting quite the Q3 growth from Q2. Man, 690, that just scares me. I want to go 675. I feel like I'm being too bullish and I want to get a little bit less aggressive with it. What was Q2 to Q2 was not a 50% growth. It was not. It was a 33% growth. Okay. Yeah, I think 675 is plenty bullish. An additional $80 million from Q3. And of course, we'll see that number bump up a lot in Q4 with holiday sales. And we will see that number continue to not just repeat, oh, we can do 592 again in Q2 of 26, but probably increase from there, not just from GameStop efficiencies, but also from the consoles to come from Xbox and PlayStation. But I think it's all just going on Switch 2, I think 675. I would rather be more conservative than more bullish, so I'm gonna go there and hope that it's at 700, but give myself a little bit of cushion because I see everything through a bull's lens at the end of the day. But I'm trying to be cutthroat. I'm trying to be fair. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Do you feel like 675 for Q3 is too high, too low? What do you think the Switch 2 is going to sell? And then any thoughts you want to, before I make my hardware valuation video, anything you want to share on how you feel like any narratives I should be thinking about as it relates to valuing GameStop's hardware business specifically. Not talking about their whole retail business. Don't talk to me about the collectibles yet. Just the hardware specifically. Anything you want to make sure I think about as it relates to how to value that business. All right. Thanks, guys, for watching. I will see you on the next one. Until then.